Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial we're going to look at vectors in C++. So we're going to start looking at the standard template library, STL. Now the standard template library has a ferocious sounding name, and I actually avoided learning about it for years. I was doing C++ for years before I started looking at it. But when I did look at it, I could have kicked myself because it's actually extremely useful and not that complicated. It's just that it has a name, Standard Template Library, that makes it sound as though it's going to be really complicated and too abstract to be useful, but that's not at all the case. So a vector is basically like a resizable array. So I'm going to include vector up here. It's possible you might have to include vector.h on some systems, and I'm using the standard namespace because all this stuff is in the standard namespace. And I'm going to declare an object of type vector here. Now a vector is what we call a template class in C++. We'll look at templates later in this course. And that means that you have to tell it what type of object it's going to work with. So in angle brackets immediately after the class name here, so this is the type of the variable I'm going to create, you can put the type of thing that's going to be in the vector. Now in fact here I'd like to create a vector of string just for this tutorial, so I'm going to call this strings. So this says we're going to create a vector that contains strings. Now one thing I can do here, but it's not necessary, it depends how you use the vector, is you can declare, you can pre-size the vector. So let's say that it's going to be a vector of 5 strings. Now we can set the elements in this vector like this. So we say strings, let's for example set the element of index 3. And we can use the square brackets operator, which is overloaded. And again, we'll look at operator overloading later on too. It's overloaded for the vector class, so that vector works like an array in the way that you can use it. Let's say strings 3 equals dog. And then its output, and again we can use the square bracket operator to access the value in strings. So if we run this, we get dog. Now I've got a warning here, invalid overload of endler, but that's just a bug in Eclipse CDT, which apparently is being fixed, but doesn't seem to be fixed in my version. So if you get that, but your program works and compiles, don't worry about it. Now this, well this is great, but you might think, what's the advantage of using this over an array? Well, in actual fact, vector is resizable. It will automatically handle memory for you. So we can do stuff like we can add extra strings to the vector. So to do that, I can say strings.push_back. Let's add the string 1 here. And let's copy that, add a couple more. So I'm going to add 2 and 3. So I pre-sized the vector to have 5 units in it, 5 elements. Then I added 3 more to it. So we've now got 8 elements in there, and we can see that if we do strings.size like this, endler. Let's run this, and we will find that we've got 8 elements in there. So if you're only going to do push back, you don't need to supply this value here. So we could get rid of that. We could get rid of setting the dog here. And now we've got 1, 2, 3 elements, and they will be at index 0, 1, 2, just like in an array. So let's output element 1, which is going to be this here, and run this. So now we've got a vector which is going to have 3 elements in it because it resizes automatically. So if we run it, we see that we output 2, and we see that the size of the vector is 3 because that's how many elements we've added. One thing you want to avoid doing is setting an element that's off the end of the vector. So if you pre-size your vector, let's say to 5 elements, you don't then want to use this notation to set element 10 if you do that, it won't throw an exception, but the behavior of it is undefined, so you can't rely on anything working in that case. So if you do presize the vector, you can happily use pushback, but don't start trying to set elements that are off the end of the current size of the vector. Now, to iterate through a vector, there are a couple of syntaxes we can use. Let's take a look at the one first that will be perhaps the most familiar looking. Let's say for int I equals 0, I less than strings.size I plus plus, and of course now all we have to do is find the right brackets on my keyboard. There we go. All we have to do is do cout strings, use this these square brackets accessor, and output the elements like this. So this is going to loop through all the elements in our vector. Now this isn't perhaps the recommended syntax to use. If we use let's say strings dot begin, this will actually give us a thing called an iterator, which points to the first element in the vector. So we can declare an iterator like this. We can say vector, and we need to repeat the kind of type information here. So it's a vector of string, and then we'll get from that the iterator, call it it, and we can set that equal to the return value of strings.begin. And this iterator object overloads the star operator, so we can now access that iterator as though it was a pointer by dereferencing it like this. So if we do this, we're going to output the first element in this vector. Now there's also a vector end method, and that returns an iterator that points just after the end of the vector, and we can use these two facts to actually loop through the vector. There's one more thing that I'll show you first, which is that if we do it plus plus, if we increment it, the iterator also overloads the increment operator. So that will give us an iterator to the next item after the first one. So let's take a look at that. And now we've got 2 being output here. So we can use all these facts to build a for loop to iterate through the vector. Let's say for, and we're gonna use this stuff here. So let's cut it from there, paste it in here, and I'll delete this, and we're gonna keep iterating through this vector until, well, as long as the iterator does not refer to strings.end. So as long as it's not equal to the end, which is not that last element, remember, it's the element that's just off the end of the vector. It's the element after the last one, which is, it's not exactly an element, so it's kind of the point after the last element. And so we're going to set the iterator to start with strings begin, keep doing the loop while the iterator doesn't refer to the end, and meanwhile increment it. And by doing that, we can then use the star operator to output whatever the iterator currently refers to. So if we look at this, we've now got 1, 2, 3. And we can also decrement the iterator with minus minus, so we can use it to move about in the vector. For that matter, we can also say stuff like, if we get an iterator to the start here, we can say it plus equals 2, and then do cout thing pointed to by it. So just like using a lot like using a pointer here, which we covered in my beginner's course, and now we see it's pointing to element 3. So I'm going to give you a little exercise here, which is it's just to create a vector and put some elements in it. You can create a vector of ints or strings or whatever you like. It could be a primitive type or a class type. And then try iterating through it with a normal kind of for loop, and then try iterating through it with this syntax. So I'd recommend typing it out and following the code that you see here, but then try to do it again. Try to do this from memory. And if you have the enthusiasm, try to get to the point where you can type this code out, including, of course, this kind of stuff, from memory. Because once you can do this from memory, even if it's only just once and it then leaves your memory, it really forces you to think about how you get the start of the vector, how you get the end of it, what's actually happening in this loop. So if you can end up typing this out from memory along with this stuff, even if you only just do it once, it will just hugely help you to understand vectors. And you can also try, if you want, just using numbers to move the iterator backwards and forwards. It's also kind of interesting. So that's it for this tutorial. Until next time, happy coding.